So let's look at this scenario. Marcus got a video game system for his birthday along with 3 different games. He decides to buy 2 extra games every month. Okay? Well, let's think. Is this a linear relationship or a linear function? Is this linear? Is this linear? Well, clearly it is, right? First of all, if we plot a bunch of points of the relationship, we can definitely connect them with a straight line, and it meets the definition of linear, being that it changes at a constant rate, right? Every month, his number of video games increases by 2, right? Every month, his number of video games increases by 2. So let's take a moment and think about what everything means here. So what do the y values or the f of x values that are graphed on the y-axis mean? Well, that's his number of video games, he has for each different month, right? That's the number of video games he has for each different month, right? Let's take a look at some of these points. Let's look at our first point here, right? 0, 3, that means he has 3 video games to start with, right? He decides to buy 2 extra games every month. But he started with 3 games. So before he even begins this process, right, he already has the 3 games. After 1 month, right, he adds 2 more games. So the y value is 5, right? After the second month, he adds 2 more games, right? So the y value is 7, right? And those are the y values or the f of x values, the number of video games he has each month. So let's remember we're using the form y equals mx plus b, right? Let's just remind ourselves of that, y equals mx plus b. What does m mean in this case, right? What is m, right? M is the slope, right? M is the slope of the line, where we can think about it as the rate of change, right? And what is it in this case? Well, it's 2, right? In this case, m equals 2, right? Because he buys 2 more video games each month, right? He buys 2 more video games each month, so m is 2 because the rate of change is 2. It's a constant rate of change. So therefore, the slope of the line that represents this function is 2, right? So m equals 2 in this case. Let me just make some room for just a minute. Let me make some room here. Let me make some room. Let's write down the fact that we know that m, right? M is equal to 2, right? We're going to work on actually creating an equation for this function. M is going to be 2, right? And what about b? What does b mean? B is, right, the y-intercept. B is the y-intercept. Or if we're thinking about it as a linear function, we can think about it as the initial value, right? B is the y-intercept or initial value. In the case we're looking at right now, that's the number of games he started with, right? That's the number of games he started with. And what's that in this case? In this case, it's actually 3, right? The number of games he started with is 3. And x, of course, is just how many months after he started buying these games, right? Like x equals 3 means this is the 3rd month after he started buying these games. X equals 4 means that this is the 4th month after he started buying these games, right? So how can we combine all of this into our equation? We know m and we know b, so we know this linear relationship can be modeled by the line y equals 2x plus 3, right? Or if we wanted to write this in explicit form, we can write this as f of x equals 2x plus 3. Okay, let's look at this scenario. Jamal has 13 video games. He decides to sell them. He is able to sell 3 video games each week. Okay? This is a linear relationship, right? And it can be modeled with a linear function, right? because the amount of video games he has changes at a constant rate. Specifically, the amount of video games he has decreases by 3 every week, right? So let's write this in the form f of x equals mx plus b. That's explicit form. Let's remember that x in this scenario is the independent variable. It means the number of weeks since he started selling his games. F of x is how many games he still has after x weeks, right? So let's just take a look at this at a couple points on this graph so that we're sure that this all makes sense, right? Let's look at this point. This point is 0, comma 13, right? So if x is 0, that means he hasn't started selling his games yet, right? And the corresponding y value, or the f of x value, is 13, which means before he starts selling his games, he has 13 games, right? That makes sense. What's our second point? Our second point is 1 comma 10, right? Well, that makes sense. After x equals 1 week, he has y equals 10, or f of x equals 10 video games left, right? If he sold 3, he has 10 now, right? And same thing, let's look at one more point. That's 2 comma 7, right? So after 2 weeks, he would have been able to sell 6 games, right? So it should make sense that the f of x value is his initial value minus 6, right? 13 minus 6 equals 7. So after 2 weeks of selling 3 video games per week, he has 7 video games left at that point, right? So let's fill out the rest of our information here. Let's figure out what m means. Remember, m is the slope of this line, or it's the rate of change, right? What's the rate of change of this relationship? Well, he's decreasing the number of video games he has by 3 each week. So m in this case is going to be -3, right? Or rather, let me write m equals -3, right? Because the rate of change is -3. And what is b here, right? B is the y-intercept, right? It's the y-intercept, or the initial value. And what's his initial value? The amount of games he started with, right, is 13. So b is going to be equal to 13. So let's make some room here. Let me make some room. Let's get rid of some of this. And let's write our equation, right? Let's write our equation. Let's write if our linear function is in the form f of x equals mx plus b, this linear function here can be modeled by f of x equals -3x plus b. -3, right? Because the rate of change is negative, because his number of video games is decreasing each week, right? Whoops, I miswrote that. I didn't want to write b, I want to write the number, which we know to be b. We know that b is equal to 13. So our function is going to be f of x equals -3x plus 13. And remember that this value of b, right, this is also f of 0, right? That's the amount of video games he has after 0 weeks of selling, right? Before his selling even started. And let's just calculate that to make sure that makes sense. What would f of 0 be? F of 0, 0 weeks before he started selling his video games. Well, we're going to take our formula and plug in 0 where we see x, right? Because we're evaluating f of x for x equals 0. What's that going to equal? -3 times 0 is 0. 0 plus 13. And of course, that's just 13, right? F of 0 is 13, which is the y-intercept, right? Because at the y-intercept, right, x is equal to at the y-intercept, right, x is equal to 0. And at f of 0, before he started selling his video games, he has 13 of them, right? His initial value. And so let's just remind ourselves, this relationship here is modeled by the linear equation f of x equals -3x plus 13.